Okay. Okay. Good evening. It's May the 22nd, 5:16 p.m. So I have like a little speech prepared for you all to inform you on what's happening, not only in Vance County, but in the state of North Carolina, not only in the state of North Carolina, but the whole entire United States. Okay. You know, politics is not really a lot of people's forte. Okay, it wasn't my forte. But I really started getting into it because these issues and problems are, to me, life-changing. These decisions are life-changing for the state of humanity, okay? So I have something prepared that I'm going to read for y'all. Like, I had to put it down on paper so that my thoughts can be expressed chronologically in a structured way, so everybody has the information. So it's almost like a monologue. All right. So I'm going to read it to you. Over the past year or so, I kept seeing more and more conversations about data centers, TikToks, news articles, community discussions, reports from different states. Every time I saw something about a data center, I paid attention. So when I came across the Board of Commissioners meeting on Facebook about rezoning land here in Vance County, and I started seeing people in my community mentioning a possible data center, my ears immediately perked up. I ended up making a Facebook Live about it, and that video got around 50,000 views. In that video, I was just sharing my thoughts, my concerns, and the information I gathered over time about data centers. It was never about fear-mongering. I just wanted to bring, awareness. It was just basically me saying, hey, this is what I'm seeing, this is what I'm learning, and this is how I personally feel about it. After that, I started paying closer attention to the Board of Commissioners meetings. There was an application submitted through Planning and Development to rezone about 40 acres of land. And when people looked into the applicant, the very first thing that came up when researching them was an article about a proposed data center project in Apex. What stood out to me is that Apex responded by putting a 1-year moratorium in place so they could slow down, gather information, update ordinances, study the impact, and make a sound decision for their community. That's what responsible leadership looks like. You pause, you research, you involve the public before making a major decision. But when it came to our county, there wasn't really a clear proposal presented to the public. Instead, during the public hearing, the company had their attorneys speak on their behalf. And essentially, the message was, we don't have specific plans right now. Citizens should just consider all possible uses under light industrial zoning. Now, let's be real. People weren't buying that. Residents showed up saying no. Community members voiced concerns. Even a couple of commissioners themselves said they needed more information before making a decision. So instead of voting right then, they pushed it back and scheduled another date about a month later. But then suddenly, A special call meeting gets scheduled 2 weeks earlier than the original date to vote on the rezoning. And during that meeting, only one commissioner voted against it. The rest kept repeating the same lines. We're voting on rezoning the land, not voting on a data center. But realistically, people understand how this process works. Rezoning the land is the pathway that allows the project to happen. So to many residents, those two things are directly connected. What also stood out to me was the overwhelming response from citizens saying they did not want this. And regardless of anyone's personal opinion about data centers, elected officials are supposed to represent the voices of the people in their districts. That's the whole point of representation. This is not about what one commissioner personally wants. It's about listening to the collective concerns of the community you were elected to serve. Then something else happened that really made me stop and think. Okay? One of my friends from Texas called me and she told me they were dealing with the exact same thing in her area. Same conversations, same concerns, same push for data centers. And to me, that was peculiar because we're states apart, completely different communities, but people all over the country are suddenly having the same fights at the same time. And if you've been paying attention online, you've probably noticed it too. Counties across America are debating data centers right now. Communities are pushing back. Some towns are putting moratoriums in place just so they can slow down and actually study the long-term impact before making a decision. So I think before people can have an honest conversation about whether they want one or not, we first need to understand what a data center actually is. A data center is basically a massive industrial facility filled with servers and computer systems that store and process digital information. So every time you stream a movie, use social media, upload pictures, use AI, send emails, use cloud storage, all of that data has to physically exist somewhere. And these buildings are where a lot of that information is stored and processed. Now, the older idea of a data center was smaller, but the ones being proposed today, especially these AI-driven hyperscale data centers, are huge. We're talking about enormous campuses that require massive amounts of electricity, massive cooling systems, and huge amounts of water to keep those servers from overheating. And this is where the conversation becomes bigger than just jobs or economic development. Okay? During the city of Henderson's budget meeting, the finance director said some things that honestly raised concern for me. First, let's talk about how local governments even make money. Counties and cities survive off things like property taxes, sales taxes, court fees, utility revenues, permits, and state funding. And Henderson specifically, revenue also comes from our ownership stake in Carr Lake Regional Water System, where water services extend to surrounding counties and communities. So when local governments are financially struggling, they start looking for large industries and developments that can bring in immediate revenue. During that budget meeting, the finance director explained that the city had increased salaries for public safety workers like police officers, firefighters, EMS personnel, because they want to stay competitive and keep people employed here. And I completely understand that. But we also have to be honest about the other side of that conversation. When communities struggle with poverty, low wages, underfunded education systems, and crime, it becomes harder to recruit and retain professionals. People leave for places with better opportunities, better pay, and more stability. And when governments are financially strained, they start depending heavily on every source of revenue they can get. Property taxes, court fees, citations, development deals, anything that keeps the budget afloat. What really stood out to me was when the finance director basically said these data centers cannot come fast enough because the county has been pulling so much from its savings reserves over the past few years that by the 2027 or 2028 budget cycle, these reserves could be nearly depleted. That means broke, no money. So now you have a county that needs revenue immediately. And that's what concerns me. When a community is economically vulnerable, when people are struggling financially, when leadership feels pressure to generate money fast, that creates the perfect environment for large corporations to come in with billion-dollar projects and promises of economic relief. And desperation can cloud long-term decision-making. That doesn't mean that every data center is automatically bad. I want to be fair about that. Some people argue they bring tax revenue, infrastructure investment, and temporary construction jobs. But communities also deserve transparency about the trade-offs. Because environmentally, these facilities can have major impacts. Data centers consume enormous amounts of electricity. Some experts believe AI expansion can dramatically increase future energy demand across the country. They also require huge cooling systems and may use massive amounts of water every single day. And for communities already worried about drought, water access, utility costs, environmental quality, or energy infrastructure, those are legitimate concerns. People are asking questions about noise pollution, land use, heat generation, strain on power grids, and whether the long-term jobs actually match the scale of the project being proposed. So for me, this conversation is not about being anti-technology. It's about asking, who benefits? Who pays the long-term cost? And are citizens being given enough information to make informed decisions before these deals are approved? Then I started zooming out and looking at the bigger picture. Because to me, local government is a microcosm of what's happening at the state level. If these conversations are happening in small towns and counties, then something bigger has to be happening across North Carolina as a whole. That's when I came across House Bill 1080, the Public Safety Reinvestment Act. And when I read through it, a lot of things started clicking for me. Now, let me be clear. I'm not saying everything in this bill is bad. Some of it actually makes sense. Some of it is necessary. But what stood out to me was the language and what is revealed and what it reveals about the conditions of our systems right now. Okay? The bill talks about hiring additional assistant and deputy clerks in Wake County and Mecklenburg County. It talks about increasing salaries for the Department of Correction, increasing pay for state highway patrol, supporting juvenile justice programs, strengthening the state crime lab, and modernizing public transit safety. And then there's this part that really stood out to me. The bill literally says that chronic and historic underfunding and workforce instability in critical state institutions have contributed to a public safety crisis where courts and jail systems are overburdened, responses are delayed, and risks to the public and the frontline workers are increasing. Think about that for a second. Think about that lady that just shot the attorneys outside the courthouse because of the way that they're handling her case. This is not just one, hold on, sorry. This is not just one struggling county saying this. This is the General Assembly acknowledging statewide instability in major systems. And if Wake County and Mecklenburg County, some of the largest and wealthiest counties in North Carolina, are struggling with staffing shortages, overcrowded courts, retention issues, and public safety concerns, then imagine what smaller counties are dealing with behind the scenes. That's why when I watched our local budget meeting, it immediately connected in my mind. because it's the same pattern. Not enough staff, not enough funding, trouble retaining workers, overworked systems, pressure to generate revenue quickly. It's the same conversation happening at different levels. Now, another part of the bill talks about requiring emergency trauma kits and first aid training on public transportation systems. And honestly, I think that part is smart. Preparedness is important. But I also pay attention to what policies signal collectively. Because when lawmakers start emphasizing emergency response infrastructure, workforce shortages, correctional staffing, court backlogs, public safety recruitment, transit safety, and operational instability all in the same bill, that tells me they're acknowledging deeper structural strain across multiple systems at once. And again, I'm not saying this to create fear. I'm saying people need to understand context, because sometimes citizens only look at one local issue at a time without realizing it's connected to a much larger statewide pattern. So when local officials say, we need revenue now, and at the same time the state is acknowledging staffing shortages, institutional instability, overcrowded systems, and public safety concerns, you start to understand why these massive development projects are being pushed so aggressively. Because governments are trying to stabilize financially, and data centers are being marketed as fast economic solutions. But the question citizens should still ask is, at what long-term cost, and who actually benefits the most? Because once land is rezoned, once infrastructure is built, once contracts are signed, communities can't easily reverse those decisions later. That's why transparency matters. That's why slowing down matters. And that's why public participation matters. Especially when the people living in these communities are the ones who will have to live with the consequences long after the meetings are over. Okay? Then I came across Bill 1089. And on the surface, the title sounds good. Property tax levy limit. Honestly, if you just hear the phrase, a lot of people are immediately going to support it because people are struggling financially right now. People don't want their property taxes going up, especially elderly people, working class families, and people on fixed incomes. And I can understand the appeal. But what caught my attention was not just what the bill says, it was also what the bill does not say. Because the actual bill is very short. And essentially, what it does is amend the North Carolina Constitution to require the General Assembly to create limits on how much local governments can increase property tax levies. But it does not clearly define what those limits are going to be. It simply says the legislature will enact them later, and there may include exceptions. That's important. Because when you amend a constitution, you're creating foundational authority. But the actual details, the enforcement, the limits, the loopholes, and the exceptions can still be shaped later through the legislation. And to me, that raises questions about control. Because property taxes are one of the primary ways local governments fund schools, infrastructures, fire departments, EMS, libraries, parks, sanitation, road maintenance, public safety, and local services. So if the state gains more power over how much local governments can raise through property taxes, then local governments become more dependent on the state or outside development for revenue. And that's where I started connecting more dots. Because if counties are already financially strained, if cities are already digging into reserve funds, if public safety systems are understaffed, and now you potentially limit local government's flexibility to generate revenue through property taxes, then where are they supposed to get the money from? Large-scale industrial projects, corporate developments, massive facilities, outside investment. That's why I keep saying these conversations are connected. And again, I'm not telling people what to think. I'm asking people to pay attention to structure, because sometimes policies sound good emotionally, but the long-term effects shift power in ways people don't immediately recognize. Now, to be fair, supporters of the bill argue it protects homeowners from rapidly rising taxes and forces government to spend more responsibly. That's their argument. But my question is this: if local governments are already struggling to maintain staffing, infrastructure, emergency services, schools, and operational stability, what happens when you further limit one of the main tools they use to fund themselves? Because power doesn't only look like force. Sometimes power looks like dependency. Sometimes control happens when systems become financially weak enough they no longer have real flexibility or bargaining power. And when communities become desperate for revenue, they become more likely to accept developments or agreements they might have questioned under stronger financial conditions. Okay? Then I came across House Bill 443. And this one made me think deeply about power, governance, and how people are still being pushed into this constant Republican versus Democrat mindset while larger structural changes are happening around us. House Bill 443 is a proposed constitutional amendment about how vacancies are filled in certain statewide offices in North Carolina. Right now, if one of those offices become vacant, the governor appoints someone to temporarily fill that position until an election happens. But this bill would change that process. Under the proposal, if the person who left office was elected as part of a political party, then the governor would have to choose a replacement from a list submitted by that same political party. Now, on the surface, supporters would probably argue that this preserves the will of the voters, meaning if people elected someone from a certain party, then the replacement should reflect the same political affiliation so the balanced voters originally chose stays intact. That's the argument. But when I look at this, I think the conversation is bigger than party politics at this point. Because honestly, people are exhausted. Everything becomes Republican versus Democrat, left versus right, red versus blue. And meanwhile, regular people across all political backgrounds are dealing with rising costs, struggling schools, public safety concerns, economic pressure, healthcare issues, housing instability, and housing instability, infrastructure problems, and distrust in institutions. These are human issues, not partisan issues. So when I read a bill that says replacement candidates should be filtered through political party structures first, one of the questions that comes to my mind is, are we prioritizing party loyalty over simply finding the most qualified person possible? Now, to be fair, this bill is not the same thing as workplace DEI policies. Legally and structurally, those are different conversations, but I understand why people would see a contradiction, because the bill essentially says political affiliation must remain a determining factor in who is eligible to replace someone in office. And for many citizens, especially independent voters or people tied and for many citizens, it's essentially independent voters or people tired of political parties altogether that raises concerns about whether the system is becoming more centered around preserving party power instead of a broad public trust. And again, I think the deeper issue here is not even Democrat versus Republican. The deeper issue is a centralization of power. Because when political systems become heavily party controlled, people start feeling like decisions are being made inside political structures instead of open through public consensus. What also stands out to me is that this is another constitutional amendment proposal. And constitutional amendments matter because they're foundational. They reshape how power operates long term. Once something gets embedded into the Constitution, reversing it becomes much harder. That's why I keep saying people need to slow down and really read what's happening. Not emotionally, not tribally, not just through party lenses, but structurally. Ask yourself, does this increase flexibility or reduce it? Does this broaden representation or strengthen party systems? Does this give citizens more influence or political organizations more influence? And when I step back and look at all of this together, I'm not going to lie, it starts feeling like isolated policies and more like a larger restructuring of power happening in real time. You have constitutional amendments being proposed. You have local governments under financial pressure. You have public safety systems saying they're understaffed and overwhelmed. You have increasing dependence on large corporate developments for revenue. You have political structures tightening control over appointments and decision-making processes. And for a regular citizen watching all of this unfold at real time, it can feel deeply unsettling. Now, I'm not saying there's some secret conspiracy happening behind closed doors. I believe a lot of these issues are rooted in real financial strain, institutional stress, and political agendas competing with each other. But I do think people should pay attention anytime power starts becoming more centralized, anytime communities feel like their voices are being ignored, and anytime major structural changes are happening faster than the public can fully process them. Because democracy is supposed to involve transparency, public participation, accountability, and informed consent from the people. And when citizens overwhelmingly speak on issues but still feel unheard, trusts start breaking down. That's why people are frustrated. That's why people across different countries, different counties, different states, and different political backgrounds are all raising concerns at the same time. Not because everyone agrees on every issue, but because people can feel that something bigger is shifting economically, politically, and socially. And whether you're Republican, Democrat, Independent, or completely apolitical, citizens have a responsibility to stay informed, ask questions, and pay attention to how power is moving around. And that's all I have to say about that. And I want y'all to rewatch this video. If it's something that you don't understand, look it up, because this affects the state of humanity, essentially.